The first time Wilhelmina Anderson opened her mouth in Lone Pine, Arizona territory, 3 men left the general store before she'd finished her second sentence. The shopkeeper, a round man with impressive mutton chops, had simply pointed to a shelf of plain yellow bars and turned his attention to someone else. Wilhelmina, called Willa by those who knew her well, was 22 years old and had been talking since she could draw breath, according to her late mother. She had opinions about everything, stories about most things, and an unfortunate tendency to share both whether anyone asked or not. Her father, a banker who died the previous winter, had often said she could talk the ears off a brass monkey. Her aunts in Philadelphia, who'd inherited her along with her father's debts, had been less kind. "No man will ever marry you if you don't learn to hold your tongue," Aunt Prudence had said, her lips pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. "You'll die a spinster, mark my words," Aunt Margaret had added, shaking her head with what Willa recognized as poorly concealed relief. After all, if Willa never married, she'd be their responsibility, but she'd also be their unpaid help. That future had stretched before Willa like a prison sentence, so when she'd seen the advertisement in the newspaper seeking a schoolteacher for Lone Pine, Arizona territory, she'd applied immediately. Teaching required talking, didn't it? Perhaps out west, where everything was different, her particular gift for conversation might be seen as an asset rather than a flaw. The town of Lone Pine sat in a valley surrounded by rust-red mountains, about 40 miles south of Tucson. It existed primarily because of the copper mine and the stubborn people who believed they could carve civilization out of the desert. Willa had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1883, when the heat still hung over everything like a heavy blanket, but the worst of summer had passed. The schoolhouse was a single room with a pitted wooden floor and windows that didn't quite close all the way. Willa stood in the doorway on her first morning, watching children file in with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. 14 students, ages 6 to 15, all examining her with the particular intensity of young people confronted with someone different. "Good morning," Willa began, and then she was off, introducing herself with such enthusiasm that by the time she'd finished explaining her philosophy of education, where she was from, why she'd come west, what subjects they'd be studying, and how she hoped they'd all become great friends, the oldest boy in the back row was slouched so far down in his seat he was nearly horizontal. "Miss Anderson." A small girl with braids raised her hand timidly. "Yes, do call me Miss Willa, or just Miss if that's too familiar, though I do think it's nicer when we're friendly, don't you? What's your name, dear? Those are lovely ribbons in your hair. Are they blue or more of a periwinkle? I never can tell in this light. The sun here is so different from Philadelphia, much more golden somehow, don't you think? What was your question?" The girl blinked. "I was just going to ask if we could start our lessons." 3 weeks into the term, Willa overheard 2 mothers talking outside the general store. "She's a fine teacher, I suppose, knows her letters and numbers well enough," one said. "But Lord, does that woman ever stop talking?" the other replied. "My Sarah says sometimes Miss Anderson gets going on a subject, and they don't finish the lesson because she's told them 17 stories about Philadelphia. Poor thing will never find a husband out here. These cowboys want quiet women who won't bother them after a long day." Willa had walked away quickly, her cheeks burning, but the words stayed with her. She tried to be quieter, truly she did. She'd stand in front of the classroom and tell herself to stick to the lesson, just the lesson, nothing extra. But then little Tommy would mention his dog, and Willa would remember the terrier she'd had as a child, and before she knew it, 15 minutes had passed, and she told them about the time Biscuit had chased a cat up a tree and gotten stuck himself, and how the fire brigade had to come, and wasn't it funny how animals had such personalities, and did any of them have pets with unusual habits? The children seemed to like her, even if their parents found her exhausting. But Willa couldn't help feeling lonely in the evenings when she returned to her small room behind the schoolhouse, with no one to talk to but herself. It was on a Saturday in late October when she first met Dalton Reeves. Willa had walked to the edge of town where a small creek trickled through, carrying her worn copy of Whitman's poetry. She'd settled on a rock, reading aloud because she'd always understood things better when she heard them, and was deep into Song of Myself when a voice interrupted. "That's a mighty fine recitation." Willa started so violently she nearly dropped the book into the water. Standing a few feet away, leading a paint horse by the reins, was a tall man in dusty trail clothes. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a few days' worth of beard on his lean face, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between green and brown. She paused for breath. "I'm Willa Anderson, the schoolteacher." The man's mouth quirked up on one side. "Dalton Reeves, most folks call me Dal. I work at the Bar R Ranch about 10 miles north." "Is that your ranch, the Bar R, or does the R stand for Reeves? Do you own it or work for someone else?" "I'm sorry. I don't mean to pry. I'm just curious about how things work out here. I'm still so new to everything. Only been in Lone Pine since September, and there's so much I don't understand about ranching and cattle and all of it. Back in Philadelphia, the closest I got to livestock was the horses pulling carriages, and that's hardly the same thing at all." "The R does stand for Reeves," Dalton said, and Willa noticed he spoke slowly, carefully, like each word was chosen with intention. "But it's not my ranch. Belongs to my uncle, Robert Reeves. I've worked there since I was 16. I'm 26 now, been doing it long enough to know which end of a cow bites." He smiled then, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Willa's heart do an odd little skip. "The horse end, in case you were wondering." Willa laughed, delighted. "That's terrible. Cows don't bite horses. You're teasing me, though I suppose I deserve it for asking so many questions. People always tell me I ask too many questions and talk too much, and I'm doing it again. I really should let you speak. You probably had a reason for stopping here besides listening to me ramble about Whitman." "Actually," Dalton said, settling himself on a nearby rock without being invited, which Willa found wonderfully presumptuous in a good way, "I stopped because I heard someone reading poetry by the creek and had to see who it was. Wasn't expecting someone like you. Someone like me." "What does that mean? A woman? An Easterner? Someone who can't seem to stop talking for more than 30 seconds at a time?" The last part came out more bitter than she'd intended. Dalton's eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and also never look away. "I meant someone who reads Whitman for fun on a Saturday afternoon. That's not common out here, and for what it's worth, I don't mind the talking." "You say that now, but you've only known me for about 3 minutes, which is hardly enough time to become properly annoyed. Most people need at least 15 minutes, though some have managed it faster. There was this one gentleman on the train who lasted maybe 8 minutes before he moved to another car entirely, and I wasn't even talking to him, just to the woman next to me about the landscape." "How about this?" Dalton said, and his voice had a warm quality that reminded Willa of honey. "Why don't you keep talking and I'll let you know if I get annoyed?" So she did. Willa told him about Philadelphia, about her father's death, about her aunts and their tight-lipped disapproval of everything she did or said or thought. She told him about the journey west, about the terror and excitement of stepping off the train in Tucson and taking the stage to Lone Pine. She told him about the schoolhouse, her students, the way the desert looked in the morning when the sun turned the mountains pink. Dalton listened to all of it, occasionally asking a question but mostly just watching her with those creek-colored eyes, his expression attentive and calm. When she finally ran out of words, the sun had moved considerably across the sky. "I've been talking for over an hour," Willa said, horrified. "You should have stopped me." "Why would I do that?" Dalton stood, stretching slightly. "I enjoyed it. Learned more about you in an hour than I know about some people I've worked with for years." He gathered his horse's reins. "I should get back. Uncle Robert will wonder where I've gone." "I'm sorry for keeping you," Willa said, standing as well and brushing dust from her skirt. "You didn't keep me." "I stayed because I wanted to." Dalton looked at her for a long moment. "Would you mind if I came by again, maybe next Saturday, to listen to me read Whitman, to listen to you read or talk or whatever you'd like to do?" Willa felt something warm bloom in her chest. "I'd like that very much." The next Saturday, Dalton arrived at the creek with sandwiches wrapped in cloth and a canteen of cool water. Willa had brought a different book, this time Dickens, but they ended up talking instead of reading. She learned that Dalton's parents had died when he was young, that his uncle had raised him, taught him everything about ranching and horses and the land. She learned that he was quiet by nature, that he preferred listening to speaking, that he'd always felt a bit apart from the other ranch hands who spent their free time drinking and gambling in town. "I like peaceful things," he told her. "A good horse, open country, the sound of rain on a roof. Most people want excitement, but I've always wanted the opposite." "And yet you don't seem bored by me," Willa said, "which is remarkable because I'm possibly the least peaceful person I know. My brain never stops. There's always something I'm thinking about or remembering or wondering about, and it all just comes out through my mouth whether I want it to or not." "You're not unpeaceful," Dalton said thoughtfully. "You're more like a creek, always moving, always making sound, but it's a good sound. Natural. Some silence is peaceful, but some silence is just empty. You fill up the empty spaces." No one had ever put it that way before. Willa felt tears prick her eyes. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my talking." Then people haven't been paying attention. They met every Saturday after that, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons when Dalton could get away from the ranch. Willa found herself watching for him during the week, her heart lifting whenever she spotted a rider in the distance, even though she knew it couldn't possibly be him during working hours. The town began to notice. In a place as small as Lone Pine, privacy was a luxury no one really had. "I hear you've been spending time with that Reeves boy," the shopkeeper said one morning when Willa came in for supplies. "Dalton, yes, we're friends. We both enjoy reading, though he prefers American authors while I've always had a fondness for the British ones. Dickens especially, though I know he can be verbose, but then so can I, so perhaps that's why we get along. He doesn't mind when I talk about books for extended periods of time. Most people's eyes glaze over, but his never do." Willa counted out coins for the flour and sugar. "Just friends." The shopkeeper's wife had appeared from the back room, her expression knowing. "Well, yes, I mean, what else would we be? We've only known each other for a few weeks, though I suppose it's been nearly 2 months now. Time moves strangely out here, faster in some ways and slower in others. Does that make sense?" Willa felt her cheeks warming. "Girl, that man rides 20 miles round trip every weekend to sit by a creek with you," the wife said. "That's not friendship, that's courting." After Willa left, she walked back to the schoolhouse in a daze. Courting. Was that what they were doing? She'd never been courted before. She'd had gentlemen callers back in Philadelphia, but they'd always left looking exhausted, and none had ever called twice. That Saturday, she was nervous for the first time in Dalton's presence. She couldn't seem to settle into her usual pattern of talking. Her words came out jumpy, disconnected. "Something wrong?" Dalton asked after she'd started and abandoned 3 different topics in as many minutes. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store said you were courting me," Willa blurted out. "Are you?" Dalton was quiet for a moment and Willa's heart sank. Of course he wasn't. Why would he be? She was just an oddity, someone different to pass the time with. "I'd like to be," he said finally, "if you'd be amenable to it." Amenable, that's such a formal word, you usually use simpler words. "Are you nervous?" "You don't seem like the nervous type, but I suppose everyone gets nervous sometimes. I'm nervous right now, can you tell? My hands are shaking a little, see?" She held them out. Dalton took both her hands in his, which stopped the shaking but made her heart race even faster. "I'm nervous because this matters," he said. "You matter. I meant what I said before. I could listen to you forever, Willa. The way you see the world, the way you put things into words, all the connections you make that no one else sees. When I'm with you, everything seems more alive. Colors are brighter, the air smells sweeter. I think about you all week while I'm working, count down the days until Saturday." "Really?" Willa whispered. "Really?" He squeezed her hands gently. "So yes, I'd like to court you properly if you'll have me." "I'll have you, yes. Absolutely, I'd like nothing more. Though I should warn you that everyone says I talk too much and no man will ever want to marry me because of it, and I've tried to be quieter. Truly I have. But it never lasts, and I wouldn't want you to feel trapped or obligated when you realize that this is just who I am and I'm not going to change." "I don't want you to change," Dalton said firmly. "I want you exactly as you are." The courtship that followed was the happiest time of Willa's life. Dalton came to town every Saturday without fail, and often on Sundays too. They walked together, rode together when he brought an extra horse, sat by the creek while she read aloud and he whittled small figures from pieces of wood. He made her a bird, then a horse, then a tiny book that opened and closed. "You're an artist," she said, delighted by the miniature book. "Look at the detail, you can see the individual pages. How did you even do this? The pieces are so small. You must have the steadiest hands. I can barely thread a needle without stabbing myself at least twice. My uncle taught me. Said a man should know how to make things, not just tend cattle." Dalton placed the tiny book in her palm. "This one's you, always full of stories." Willa kept it in her pocket and touched it throughout the day like a talisman. In town, opinions were mixed. Some people thought it was sweet that quiet Dalton Reeves had found someone, even if that someone was the overly talkative schoolteacher. Others were more skeptical. "Give it a month," Willa overheard at the church social. "He'll tire of her constant chatter. Poor man probably can't get a word in edgewise. She's not even pretty enough to make up for all that noise." That last comment stung more than Willa wanted to admit. She knew she wasn't beautiful. Her face was too round, her hair too curly, her figure too thin. Back in Philadelphia, she'd been considered plain at best. She was quieter than usual when she met Dalton that evening for a walk. "What's bothering you?" he asked immediately. "Nothing. Just tired from the week. The children were particularly energetic, and sometimes teaching feels like trying to contain 14 small tornadoes. Though that's not entirely fair because some of them are very well behaved. Little Sarah never causes any trouble at all." The words came out automatic, a deflection. Dalton stopped walking. "Willa, what's really wrong?" She looked up at him, at his concerned face, and the truth spilled out. "Someone said I wasn't pretty enough to make up for talking too much. And I know I shouldn't care what people say. My father always told me that, but it's hard not to care when you hear it over and over. When everyone in town seems to think you're some kind of oddity, and that you've somehow trapped the poor cowboy who's too polite to escape." "Do you think you've trapped me?" "I don't know, have I?" Would you tell me if I had? You're so kind, Dalton. You might just keep pretending to enjoy my company out of some sense of obligation, or because you pity me, or because there aren't many other options in Lone Pine. And at least I'm here and available even if I'm not what anyone would actually choose if they had better options. Dalton cupped her face in his hands, calloused and warm. Look at me. When she did, his expression was more intense than she'd ever seen it. You are exactly what I would choose, not in spite of anything, not because of a lack of options, but because you're you. When you talk, I learn things. About the world, about ideas, about how you think. You make me laugh. You make me see things differently. And you're beautiful, Willa. Your eyes light up when you're excited about something. Your whole face comes alive. That's more beautiful than any silent, pretty face could ever be. You mean that? I've never meant anything more. She kissed him then, there on the road in full view of anyone who might pass by. It was her first kiss and probably not very skillful, but Dalton didn't seem to mind. When they broke apart, he was smiling. I should probably ask your intentions, Willa said breathlessly. We've been courting for 3 months now, and I don't want to pressure you, but I also don't want to be strung along if this is just a pleasant way to pass the time until someone better comes along. Willa Anderson, will you marry me? She blinked. What? You wanted to know my intentions. I'm intending to marry you if you'll have me. I was going to wait, do this properly with a ring and everything, but I can't stand the thought of you doubting how I feel for even one more day. Yes, Willa said immediately. Yes, of course, yes. I'll marry you, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day at the creek when you didn't leave after 5 minutes of me talking. And I know I should probably be more composed about this, but I'm not good at composed. I feel things too much and think too much and say too much, but you don't seem to mind, and I just love you so much. I love you too, Dalton said, and kissed her again. They were married 6 weeks later in December of 1883 in the small church in Lone Pine. Willa wore a dress she'd made herself, cream-colored with lace at the collar that she'd purchased from a traveling merchant who'd passed through town. Dalton wore his best suit, dark and formal, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. The ceremony was simple. Willa had worried she might talk through her own wedding, but when the moment came to say her vows, she found herself almost speechless with happiness. Almost. I promise to love you and honor you and try very hard not to talk your ear off, though I make no guarantees, because you know how I am and I'm so grateful you love that about me, instead of finding it annoying. And I promise to be a good wife, even though I've never done this before, so I'll probably make mistakes, but I'll try my very best, and I just love you so much. The words tumbled out in a rush. Dalton's vows were characteristically brief. I promise to love you, listen to you, and remind you every day that you're exactly who you should be. There wasn't money for a honeymoon, but Dalton's uncle had given them a small house on the ranch property, 2 rooms with a fireplace and a porch that looked out over the valley. It wasn't much, but to Willa it was paradise. This is ours, she kept saying that first night, touching the walls, the furniture, the dishes in the cupboard. We have a home, an actual home together. I've never had my own home before. Even in Philadelphia, I was always in my father's house or my aunt's house, but this is ours. Ours, Dalton agreed, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stood at the window watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Marriage suited them both. Willa continued teaching during the week, and Dalton worked the ranch, but the evenings were theirs. She'd talk about her day while cooking dinner, telling him everything the children had done, every thought she'd had, every interesting cloud formation she'd noticed. He'd listen, occasionally interjecting with a comment or question, his presence steady and comforting. Don't you ever want me to be quiet? she asked one night after she'd talked straight through dinner and washing up. No, he said simply. House was too quiet before you. I like it filled up with your voice. Winter turned to spring and spring to summer. Willa's garden flourished under her care and constant narration. She talked to the plants, told them about her day, encouraged them to grow. Dalton built her a bench so she could sit among the vegetables and read aloud. The tomatoes seemed to like Shakespeare, she informed him seriously. They're much bigger on the side where I recite the sonnets. That's so. Dalton's eyes crinkled with suppressed laughter. I'm completely serious. Plants respond to sound. I read about it in a journal, though I suppose correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Maybe that side just gets better sun, but I'd like to think they appreciate good poetry. In late summer, Willa realized she was pregnant. She told Dalton immediately, the words spilling out in a torrent of excitement and fear and joy. You're going to be a wonderful mother. The baby will be lucky to have you. How do you know? Because you care so much. About everything, everyone. You're going to love this child with your whole heart, and that's what matters. The pregnancy was difficult. Willa was sick for months, barely able to keep food down. She hated being quiet and still, but her body demanded it. Dalton took over the cooking, the cleaning, everything, and sat with her in the evenings reading aloud from her books since she was too exhausted to do it herself. This isn't fair to you, she said weakly one night. You didn't sign up to be a nursemaid. I signed up to be your husband. In sickness and in health, remember, the baby came in early April of 1885 after a labor that lasted nearly 2 days. Willa talked through most of it, a running commentary of pain and fear and determination that the midwife later said was the most unusual delivery she'd ever attended. Most women scream or cry, she told Dalton. Your wife described the entire experience like she was narrating a novel. Their son was born healthy and howling, with a full head of dark hair in his father's eyes. They named him Daniel Robert, after both their fathers. Willa fell in love instantly and completely. She talked to the baby constantly, narrating everything she did, telling him about the world he'd been born into, singing him songs she half remembered from her own childhood. You're going to teach him to talk early, Dalton observed, watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made Willa's heart ache. Is that a bad thing? Not at all. I want to hear what he has to say. Daniel was indeed an early talker, forming words at 10 months and full sentences shortly after his first birthday. He was also, to Willa's delight and occasional exhaustion, every bit as talkative as his mother. I created a monster, she said fondly, watching 2-year-old Daniel chatter away to the chickens in the yard. You created a wonderful little boy, Dalton corrected. Though I'll admit, 2 of you talking at once is challenging to keep up with. Do we overwhelm you? In the best way. When Daniel was 3, Willa became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born in the winter of 1888, small and perfect with curly hair the color of honey. They named her Margaret Rose after Willa's mother. Margaret was quieter than her brother, more observant. She'd watch everything with solemn eyes, taking it all in. Dalton said she was like him, content to listen. That's good, Willa said, nursing the baby while Daniel told her an elaborate story about a frog he'd seen by the creek. Someone in this family should be a good listener, otherwise we'd never have any audience. Life settled into a rhythm. Willa had given up teaching when Daniel was born, but she sometimes held informal lessons for the ranch children, teaching them to read under the big cottonwood tree. Dalton had worked his way up to foreman of the Bar R, and his uncle had promised that someday the ranch would be his. We're building something, Willa said one evening, watching Dalton play with the children in the yard. A whole life, a family, a future. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that I get to have this, that someone like you wanted someone like me. Someone like you, Dalton repeated, coming to sit beside her on the porch steps. You mean smart, funny, kind, beautiful, the best mother I could have imagined for my children, the person who makes every single day better just by being in it. I was thinking more along the lines of talks too much and scares off most normal people. Good thing I'm not normal people. The years passed, marked by small moments of joy and occasional challenges. There were droughts that made ranching difficult, winters that came harsh and early, the everyday struggles of making a life in an unforgiving land. But through it all, they had each other. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy who asked a million questions and had an opinion about everything. Margaret remained quiet but had a wicked sense of humor that surprised people. When she did speak, it was usually to deliver a perfectly timed observation that had everyone laughing. She gets that from you, Willa told Dalton. Gets what? The ability to say more with less. I use 100 words when 10 would do. She uses 10 and makes them count. In 1892, when Daniel was 7 and Margaret was 4, Willa's Aunt Prudence wrote from Philadelphia. Aunt Margaret had died, and Prudence wanted to know if Willa might consider coming back east to help settle the estate. I don't want to go, Willa told Dalton, holding the letter. There's nothing for me there anymore. Everything I love is here. Then don't go. Write back and tell her you're sorry, but your life is here now. Willa did exactly that, and in the writing, she found herself pouring out everything she'd never been able to say to her aunts in person. How their criticism had hurt her, how they'd made her feel less than, how she'd found in Arizona territory not just a home but a place where she could truly be herself. She told Prudence about Dalton, about the children, about the life she'd built. To her surprise, Prudence wrote back with something approaching an apology. She admitted that she and Margaret had been jealous of Willa's spirit, her inability to be diminished or quieted no matter how hard they'd tried. She said she was glad Willa had found happiness and enclosed a small inheritance that had been left to Willa in Margaret's will. It's not much, Willa told Dalton, looking at the bank draft. But it's enough to buy those books I wanted for the children, and maybe fix the barn roof before winter. Or you could buy something for yourself, Dalton suggested. The children's books are for me. I'm the one who'll be reading them aloud for the next several years. They used part of the money for books and part for practical improvements to the house. Willa also bought a beautiful journal with a leather cover and began writing down the stories she told the children, thinking that perhaps someday they might want to read about their own childhoods. The journal became a habit. She wrote in it most evenings, filling page after page with observations about the children, about life on the ranch, about the way the land changed with the seasons. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud to Dalton. Listen to this, she'd say, and then launch into a detailed description of something Daniel had said or the way Margaret had looked chasing butterflies in the yard. You should write a book, Dalton said one night. About what? About all of this. About coming west, about teaching, about our life. People would want to read it. People don't want to read my rambling thoughts, Dalton. That's absurd. But the idea planted itself in her mind. She began writing more intentionally, shaping her daily observations into something more structured. It took her 3 years, writing in stolen moments between caring for the children and helping with the ranch, but eventually she had a manuscript. What do I do with it now? She asked Dalton, looking at the stack of pages. Send it to a publisher. They'll reject it, maybe. But maybe they won't. She sent it to a small publisher in California that specialized in Western stories. 6 months later, they accepted it. They want to publish it, Willa said, staring at the letter in disbelief. They're actually going to publish my book." The book, titled Letters from Lone Pine, came out in 1897 and sold modestly but steadily. It was a collection of interconnected stories about a woman's life in the Arizona Territory, filled with humor and heart and Willa's particular way of seeing the world. Some critics called it overly verbose, but others praised its warmth and authenticity. "You're an author," Daniel said proudly. He was 12 now, nearly as tall as Willa and reading constantly. "I'm a wife and mother who happened to write a book," Willa corrected, but she was pleased nonetheless. The success of the book brought some small measure of fame. A newspaper in Tucson wanted to interview her, and occasionally people who'd read it would make the trip to Lone Pine to meet her. Willa found it all rather overwhelming but also validating in a way she hadn't expected. "See," Dalton said after one particularly gushing reader had left, "your words matter. They always have." In 1899, Willa became pregnant unexpectedly at 38. It was a shock, as she'd assumed she was done having children, but also a joy. This baby, another son, was born healthy that winter. They named him Thomas William. 3 talkers and 1 listener, Dalton observed, holding baby Thomas while Daniel and Margaret argued good-naturedly about something in the background. 2 talkers, 1 listener, and 1 we don't know yet, Willa corrected. Thomas might take after Margaret. He didn't. By the time he was 2, it was clear that Thomas had inherited his mother's verbal abilities in full. The household was rarely quiet. "Do you ever regret it?" Willa asked Dalton one night when the children were finally asleep, and they had a rare moment of peace. "Marrying someone who filled your life with so much noise." Dalton pulled her close. "Every day I wake up grateful I found you by that creek. You turned my quiet life into something full and rich and loud and wonderful. I wouldn't change a single thing." Not even the time Daniel talked for 45 minutes straight about rocks. Not even that. Though I'll admit, I understood maybe half of it. Neither did I, and I'm supposed to be the one teaching him. The new century arrived with celebration in Lone Pine. There was a dance in the town hall, and Willa and Dalton attended with the children. Willa wore a new dress she'd made, blue as the Arizona sky, and Dalton told her she was the most beautiful woman in the room. "You're biased," she said. "Absolutely. Doesn't make it less true." They danced while the children ran wild with the other ranch kids, and for a moment, Willa was transported back to that girl who'd arrived in Lone Pine 16 years ago, certain she'd never find a place where she belonged. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked. "How far we've come. How lucky I am. How I almost didn't come west because I was scared. I'm glad you were brave. I'm glad you were patient enough to listen." Daniel left for university in California in 1902, planning to study geology. His departure left a hole in the household that took time to adjust to. But his letters home were frequent and long, full of descriptions of his studies and the strange new world of academia. "He gets his love of learning from you," Dalton said, reading one of Daniel's letters aloud to Willa while she kneaded bread. "He gets his curiosity from both of us. You're always watching, always noticing things. You just don't feel the need to narrate it all like I do." Margaret, at 14, had developed into a skilled horsewoman and helped her father with the ranch work. She was quiet but competent, and the ranch hands respected her in a way they might not have if she'd been more like her mother. "She's going to be running this place someday," Dalton's Uncle Robert said. He was older now, his hair white, and talked more and more about retiring. "What about Thomas?" Willa asked. Robert laughed. "Thomas is going to talk someone into giving him whatever he wants. He'll be a lawyer or a politician. But Margaret, she's got the land in her blood." Thomas, now 3, was indeed a force of nature. He had Willa's endless energy and Dalton's stubborn determination, a combination that led to frequent adventures and minor disasters. I found him in the creek explaining to tadpoles how they'd eventually become frogs, Margaret reported one afternoon, complete with drawings in the mud. That's my boy, Willa said proudly. In 1905, Robert Reeves died peacefully in his sleep. He left the Bar R Ranch to Dalton, along with a letter expressing his pride in the man his nephew had become and the family he'd built. He said, "I chose well when I married you," Dalton told Willa, his voice thick with emotion. "Said you brought life to the place. He was a good man." "I'm sorry he's gone." "Me too." Owning the ranch changed things. There was more responsibility, more decisions to make, but also more freedom to shape things as they wanted. Dalton expanded the operation, buying more land and cattle. Willa started a small school for the ranch children again, teaching them in the same cottonwood tree shade she'd used years before. Margaret, now 17, was indeed invaluable to the ranch operations. She had a way with horses that bordered on magical, and could rope a calf as well as any of the hands. She also had a sweet, quiet romance developing with one of the newer cowboys, a young man named James Peterson, who was patient enough to wait for her rare words and smart enough to value them. "He's like you," Willa told Dalton, watching James and Margaret work together in the corral. "A listener. She needs someone who won't try to fill all her silences." "Are you saying she's wise to avoid someone like me?" "I'm saying everyone needs something different. You and I work because I need someone to fill my silences. Margaret and James work because he's comfortable with hers." Thomas started school and immediately became the teacher's favorite student and biggest challenge. He was brilliant but easily bored, creative but unfocused, charming but exhausting. "He's exactly like you were," the teacher told Willa with a mixture of fondness and exasperation. "Too smart for his own good and too talkative for mine. I apologize on his behalf. Don't. The other children love him. He makes learning fun, even if he does occasionally derail my entire lesson plan with tangential questions." Daniel graduated from university in 1906 and took a position with a mining company, using his geology knowledge to help them find new deposits. He came home for visits when he could, always bearing gifts and stories about his travels. "You're living quite an adventure," Willa told him during one visit. "I learned from the best," Daniel said. "You taught me that the world is full of interesting things, and the only way to understand them is to pay attention and ask questions." "I taught you to be annoying, you mean." "I prefer inquisitive." Margaret married James in 1907 in a small ceremony at the ranch. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and spoke her vows in a clear, quiet voice that nonetheless carried across the assembled guests. "I promise to love you, work beside you, and build a life with you that honors the land and each other," she said. James's vows were equally simple. "I promise to love you, support your dreams, and never take for granted the gift of your words when you choose to share them." They built a house on the far side of the ranch property, and James became Dalton's right-hand man in running the operation. It was everything Dalton had hoped for, a continuation of the legacy his uncle had started. Willa published 2 more books over the years, both collections of stories about life in the territory. They never made much money, but they found their audience, people who appreciated her particular voice and perspective. "You've made a name for yourself," Dalton said when her 3rd book received a particularly good review in a San Francisco newspaper. "I've made a small splash in a very large pond, but I'm proud of them nonetheless." Thomas grew into a handsome, charismatic teenager who could indeed talk his way into or out of almost anything. He had plans to study law back east, following in his own path rather than staying on the ranch. "Are you disappointed?" Willa asked Dalton when Thomas announced his plans. "That he doesn't want a ranch?" "Not at all. Margaret will carry on here, and she's better at it than I was at her age. Thomas needs to find his own way, just like Daniel did." "When did you get so wise?" "I've been listening to you for over 25 years. Some of it must have rubbed off." In 1910, Arizona was moving toward statehood, and Lone Pine was growing with it. The town had electricity now, and telephone lines were being strung. The wild frontier of Willa's arrival was becoming something more settled, more civilized. "You miss how it was?" Dalton asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset just as they had countless times before. "Sometimes," Willa admitted. "But mostly I'm grateful for what we've built. This life, these children, this home. When I got off that stage in 1883, I was running away from a place where I didn't fit. I never imagined I'd find somewhere I fit so completely. You fit with me. You fit with me too. Perfectly." Margaret and James had their first child in 1911, a daughter they named Wilhelmina after her grandmother. Willa cried when they told her. "She'll probably hate having such a mouthful of a name," Willa said, holding the tiny baby. "Then she'll go by Willa like you did," Margaret said. "Or she'll choose her own nickname. Either way, she'll have a strong name to live up to." Baby Willa was, ironically, an extremely quiet baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world around her with solemn eyes. "She's taking after her mother," James observed. "Thank goodness," Margaret said. "One of me in the family is enough, according to everyone in Lone Pine." "They learn to appreciate you," Dalton said, "just like they learn to appreciate your mother. Sometimes the best people are the ones who don't fit the mold." Thomas left for Harvard Law School in 1912, and the house felt emptier without his constant chatter. Willa missed him terribly, but filled the void by spending more time with baby Willa and writing her fourth book. "This one's different," she told Dalton, showing him the manuscript. "It's about us. Our story. How we met, how we built this life. I've changed the names, made some things more fictional, but it's essentially our love story." "Can I read it?" She handed him the pages nervously, watching his face as he read. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "It's beautiful." "You made me sound much more eloquent than I am." "I wrote you exactly as you are. You've always been eloquent, Dalton. You just use fewer words than I do." The book, titled The Listening Heart, was published in 1913 and became Willa's most successful work. It struck a chord with readers who saw in it a different kind of love story, one based not on grand gestures but on quiet acceptance and genuine appreciation. "People are writing me letters," Willa said in amazement, holding a stack of envelopes. "Women who say they've always felt like they talked too much, who were told to be quieter, and the book made them feel seen. You've always had a gift for that, making people feel seen. I learned it from you. You saw me when no one else did." Daniel came home for a visit in 1914, bringing with him a woman he'd met in California, a geologist like himself named Catherine. She was smart and funny and could hold her own in any conversation, which delighted Willa. "I knew you'd like her," Daniel said. "She reminds me of you, actually. Not afraid to speak her mind." They married later that year, and Willa gained the daughter-in-law she'd always hoped for, someone who appreciated her son's brilliant, talkative nature because she shared it. The world beyond Lone Pine was changing rapidly. War broke out in Europe, and though America wasn't involved yet, everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Thomas wrote worried letters from Harvard, and Daniel talked about joining up if the country entered the conflict. "I hope it doesn't come to that," Willa said, holding Dalton's hand tightly. "I don't want to lose any of you to some war overseas." "We'll face whatever comes together," Dalton promised. "Like we always have." Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and Lone Pine celebrated its new status as part of the United States proper rather than a territory. The town had grown to over 1,000 people, with new businesses and even a small library that housed copies of all of Willa's books. "You're a local celebrity," the librarian told her when Willa came to donate some books. "The children all know your stories." "That's deeply strange and wonderful," Willa said, "though I'm not sure what I did to deserve it besides talk a lot and write it all down. You told the truth about what life here was like. That matters." In 1915, Margaret and James had a son, and suddenly Willa and Dalton were grandparents twice over. The baby, named Dalton James but called DJ, was a healthy, loud infant who seemed to have inherited the talking genes. "3 generations," Willa said, watching Dalton hold his namesake. "Can you believe it? Some days yes, some days no. Mostly I just feel grateful." Thomas graduated from Harvard Law School in 1916 and took a position with a firm in Boston. He promised to visit when he could, and his letters were as long and detailed as ever, full of descriptions of city life and legal cases, and the woman he was courting, a suffragette named Alina who apparently could out-talk even him. "I think I'm in love," one letter read. "She's brilliant and passionate and never stops fighting for what she believes in. She reminds me of you, Ma. I think you'd like her." "He found someone like you," Dalton observed. "All 3 of our children did in their own ways. They looked for partners who balanced them. We raised them well." "You raised them well. I just supported you." "That's not true, and you know it. You taught them how to listen, how to value other people's words. That's just as important as teaching them to speak." America entered the war in 1917, and Daniel enlisted despite Catherine's protests and Willa's fears. He served as a surveyor, using his geological knowledge to help map terrain, and made it through safely, returning home in 1919 with stories he couldn't quite bring himself to tell and a haunted look that took months to fade. "I'm just grateful you're home," Willa said, hugging him tightly. "Me too, Ma. Me too." The 1920s brought prosperity to the ranch and to Lone Pine. The cattle business was good, and Dalton and James expanded the operation further. Margaret proved to be a brilliant manager, modernizing their practices while maintaining the values Robert Reeves had instilled. Willa published 2 more books and began teaching writing workshops in Tucson, traveling there once a month to share what she'd learned with aspiring authors. She was in her late 50s now, her hair more silver than brown, but she had the same energy she'd always possessed. "Do you ever slow down?" Dalton asked, watching her pack for another trip to Tucson. "Why would I? There's too much to do, too much to see, too many stories to tell. I'll have plenty of time to be quiet when I'm dead." "Don't talk about being dead." "Why not?" "It's inevitable. We're all going to die someday. Hopefully not for a very long time, but we should acknowledge reality. And I want to make sure I've done everything I want to do before then, which includes these workshops and finishing my next book and seeing all our grandchildren grow up, and maybe even great-grandchildren if we're very lucky. You're going to outlive us all out of sheer stubborn refusal to stop talking. That's the plan." Thomas married Alina in 1922 in a ceremony in Boston that Willa and Dalton traveled east to attend. It was Willa's first time back to that part of the country since she'd left 40 years earlier, and she was struck by how foreign it felt. "This isn't home anymore," she told Dalton as they walked through Boston Common. "I thought I might feel nostalgic, but I just feel like a tourist. Home is where we built our life. Everything else is just places." The wedding was lovely, and Alina was everything Thomas had promised. Fierce, intelligent, passionate. She and Willa talked for hours about suffrage, about women's rights, about the changing world. You paved the way for women like me, Alina told Willa. Coming west alone, building a career, refusing to be diminished, that took courage. I never thought of it as courage. I just didn't see another option that would let me be myself. That's what courage is. Choosing yourself even when it's hard. Daniel and Catherine had their first child in 1923, a son named Robert after Dalton's uncle. The family was growing, spreading out across the country, but staying connected through letters and visits. "We're building a legacy," Dalton said one evening, updating the family tree he'd been keeping in the big Bible. "We're building a family. That's better than any legacy." In 1925, Willa and Dalton celebrated their 42nd anniversary. The town threw them a party, recognizing them as one of Lone Pine's founding families and longest marriages. 42 years, Willa said in her speech, because of course she gave a speech. 42 years of this patient, wonderful man listening to me talk. When we met, everyone said I talked too much, that no man would ever want a wife who couldn't be quiet. But Dalton never wanted me quiet. He wanted me exactly as I was, loud and talkative and full of opinions. He taught me that the right person won't try to change you. They'll love you for who you are, all of it, even the parts everyone else finds annoying. I told you then, and I'll tell you now, Dalton said when it was his turn. I could listen to you forever, and I intend to. The applause was thunderous. Margaret and James took over full operation of the ranch in 1927 when Dalton decided to semi-retire. He was 67 now, his hair white, his movements slower, but his mind as sharp as ever. He spent his days whittling, rating, and listening to Willa. "We've earned our rest," Willa said, though she herself showed no signs of slowing down. She was working on her 8th book, teaching workshops, and had recently started writing a newspaper column for the Tucson paper. "You haven't rested a day in your life. I'll rest when I'm dead, remember. You promised not to talk about being dead. I'm not planning on it anytime soon, don't worry. I have at least 3 more books in me, and I want to see all the grandchildren grown, and there's a great-grandchild on the way from Margaret, which means I absolutely cannot die until I've met that baby and probably several more after that." True to her word, Willa was present when Margaret's daughter Wilhelmina had her first child in 1928, a boy named Thomas after his great-uncle. 4 generations of family gathered to meet him, and Willa held court from her rocking chair, telling stories about the old days when Lone Pine was barely a town, and the desert stretched wild and untamed in every direction. "Did you really come here all alone?" young Wilhelmina asked. "I did. Took a train from Philadelphia to Tucson, then a stagecoach to Lone Pine. I was terrified but also excited, ready for adventure, and I found more than I'd ever dreamed of. Because you met Grandpa Dalton." "Because I met Grandpa Dalton," Willa agreed, smiling at her husband across the room. "And because I found a place where being myself wasn't something to apologize for." The 1930s brought hard times to much of the country, but the ranch weathered the Depression better than most. They had land, cattle, and a strong operation that Margaret and James had built to last. Willa's books provided a small but steady income, and they helped their children and grandchildren when they could. Thomas and Alina moved back west in 1932, settling in Phoenix, where Thomas opened his own law practice focusing on water rights and land disputes. They had 2 children by then, and Willa delighted in being close enough to see them regularly. Daniel and Catherine remained in California, where Daniel had risen to a senior position in his mining company. They visited every Christmas, bringing their 3 children who ran wild on the ranch and listened wide-eyed to their grandmother's stories. "You should write your autobiography," Catherine suggested during one visit. "A full account of your life, not fictionalized." Who would want to read about my life? I'm nobody special. You're a woman who came west alone in 1883, became a teacher, married a cowboy, raised 3 successful children, published 8 books, and helped build a thriving ranch. That's plenty special. Willa considered it. She was 71 now, still sharp but aware that time was finite. Maybe it was worth setting down the full truth of her story. She started writing in the spring of 1933, and the words flowed like they always had. She wrote about Philadelphia, about her father and her aunts, about the decision to come west. She wrote about meeting Dalton, their courtship, their marriage. She wrote about the children, the ranch, the books, all of it. Dalton read each chapter as she finished it. "This is good," he said. "This is your best work. You think so, I know so. It's honest, raw. You're not hiding behind fiction anymore. This is just you, your voice, your truth." She finished the manuscript in early 1934 and sent it to her publisher. They accepted it immediately and rushed it into production, sensing something special. The Talking Woman, A Life in the Arizona Territory, was published in late 1934 to widespread acclaim. It became Willa's best-selling book, resonating with readers across the country who saw in it a uniquely American story of courage, perseverance, and love. "You're famous," Dalton teased, reading yet another glowing review. "I'm old and talkative, and apparently people find that charming now instead of annoying." "I always found it charming. You're biased. Doesn't make it less true." They celebrated Willa's 73rd birthday in 1935 with all 3 children, their spouses, all the grandchildren, and the first 2 great-grandchildren in attendance. The house overflowed with noise and laughter and life. "This is what I always wanted," Willa told Dalton that night after everyone had gone to bed. "A full house, a full life, full of love and noise and people. You gave me that. We gave it to each other." Dalton's health began to fail in 1936. Nothing dramatic, just the slow decline of a body that had worked hard for 76 years. He tired more easily, moved more slowly, but his mind remained clear and his love for Willa undiminished. "I'm not ready to lose you," Willa said one night, lying beside him in the dark. "You're not going to lose me. I'll always be with you." "That's not the same, I know, but it's what we get. We've had 53 good years, Willa, more than most people get. I'm grateful for every single day. I want more days. So do I. But if I've learned anything from you, it's that we don't get to control everything. We just get to show up and do our best and love the people we're given to love." Dalton Reeves died peacefully in his sleep in March of 1937, with Willa beside him. The whole town mourned. He'd been respected and loved, a pillar of the community, a good man who'd lived a good life. Willa was devastated. For the first time in her life, she couldn't find words. She sat at his funeral, silent, while others spoke about his kindness, his integrity, his dedication to family and community. It was Margaret who finally got her to speak. "Tell us about him, Ma. Tell us your favorite memory." And then the words came, flowing like water after a drought. Willa stood and talked for 20 minutes about Dalton, about meeting him by the creek, about how he'd listened to her when no one else would, about the life they'd built together. "He said he could listen to me forever," she finished, tears streaming down her face. And he did. For 53 years he listened to every word, valued every opinion, loved every part of me. I was told I talked too much, that it would drive men away, that I'd die alone because of it. But Dalton proved them all wrong. He loved me not in spite of my words, but because of them. And I will spend the rest of my life grateful that I found him, that he found me, that we had each other. The grief was profound, but Willa didn't retreat from it. She let herself feel it fully, talk about it constantly, process it in the only way she knew how, through words. She wrote every day, letters to Dalton that she'd never send, journal entries cataloging her memories, essays about grief and loss and love. Some of it she shared with her children, some she kept private, but all of it helped her navigate the enormous absence he'd left behind. "How do you do it?" Thomas asked during a visit. "How do you keep going?" Because he'd want me to. Because we built something bigger than just the two of us, and that continues. Because I still have stories to tell, and he taught me my stories matter. Willa lived another 8 years, filling them with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with writing and teaching, with the community she'd helped build. She published 2 more books, both dedicated to Dalton's memory. She watched Margaret's children take over more of the ranch operations, saw Thomas argue cases before the Arizona Supreme Court, celebrated Daniel's promotion to company president. She was 83 when her heart finally gave out in 1945, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains the colors she'd loved for 62 years. They found her with a smile on her face and her journal open in her lap, the last entry reading simply, "Going to talk Dalton's ear off about everything he's missed. He'll pretend to be annoyed, but I know better. I know he's been waiting to listen." They buried her beside Dalton in the Lone Pine Cemetery under a headstone that read, "Wilhelmina Anderson Reeves, 1862–1945. She talked, he listened, they loved." The funeral was standing room only, filled with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with former students and readers of her books, with people whose lives she'd touched simply by being herself without apology. Margaret spoke about her mother's courage. Daniel talked about her curiosity and kindness. Thomas described her passion for justice and her unwavering belief that everyone's voice mattered. But it was young Wilhelmina, now a woman of 34 with children of her own, who perhaps captured it best. "My grandmother taught me that there's power in using your voice, in refusing to be quieted, in taking up space in a world that often tells women they're too much." She was too much for a lot of people. Too loud, too talkative, too opinionated, too present. But for Grandpa Dalton, she was exactly right. And together they proved that the right kind of love doesn't ask you to be less, it celebrates you being more. The ranch continued to thrive under Margaret's children, and then their children, a legacy built on hard work and love, and the partnership of 2 people who'd found each other by a creek in 1883. Willa's books remained in print, introduced to new generations who found in them a voice that was authentic and warm, that spoke truths about love and life in the Arizona territory. Her autobiography was taught in schools, studied by historians, beloved by readers who saw in it a uniquely American story. But perhaps her greatest legacy was simpler. She'd proved that being yourself, fully and without apology, was not just acceptable but admirable. That the right person wouldn't try to change you but would love you for exactly who you were. That what some people called too much was really just enough for the person who mattered. In Lone Pine, they still told stories about the talkative teacher from Philadelphia and the quiet cowboy who loved to listen. About how they'd built a life together in the desert, raised a family, and proved that the best love stories aren't about 2 people becoming one, but about 2 people remaining fully themselves while building something beautiful together. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, you could imagine them still. Willa talking, her words tumbling over each other in her enthusiasm to share everything she'd learned and seen and felt, and Dalton listening with that patient smile, his hand in hers, exactly as they'd always been. Together, as they were always meant to be.